Today we're diving into a science fiction trilogy that blends high-concept speculative ideas with the kind of escalating power dynamics you might expect from anime or a grounded superhero epic. The Axiom Trilogy. Axiom, Maxim, and Dictum tells the story of a world that suddenly finds itself confronting forces that challenge the very foundations of how society works. Hey everyone, this is Danny, and I'd like to welcome you to my Hidden Book Nook, where we discover and discuss hidden gems that go beyond the bestseller list, a quiet place for overlooked books. And today we're talking about the Axiom Trilogy by Kyle Durant. Let's dive in. What makes this trilogy especially interesting is that it doesn't just focus on action or spectacle. Instead, it explores something deeper. What happens when humanity gains access to power it doesn't fully understand? How do individuals, governments, and institutions respond when the rules of reality suddenly seem negotiable? Today we'll talk about the story across all three books, the characters that carry the narrative forward, and we'll spend some time discussing the author's writing style, because that's actually one of the elements that gives the trilogy its unique tone. And don't worry, this review will remain spoiler-free. At its core, the Axiom Trilogy is about a turning point in human history. The world of these books looks very similar to our own at first. Governments operate the way we expect them to. Institutions maintain order. Scientific understanding has boundaries that most people assume are fixed. But the story begins when those boundaries begin to shift. New discoveries and new abilities begin to appear. And suddenly the question is no longer just about scientific progress. It becomes about power. Who controls it? Who fears it? And who believes it should never have been discovered in the first place? Instead of immediately jumping into explosive action, the story builds tension through discovery. People start realizing that the rules they've trusted for decades may not be permanent, and that uncertainty drives much of the narrative. This trilogy leans heavily into themes that fans of superhero fiction and anime will recognize. The idea that extraordinary power forces society to confront uncomfortable questions. But unlike many superhero stories, the focus here isn't simply on heroism. It's on consequences. The first book, Axiom, functions as the foundation for the entire trilogy. Rather than throwing readers straight into chaos, the story begins with a slow, careful build. We're introduced to a group of characters who are beginning to realize that something about the world has changed, or perhaps that something hidden has finally been revealed. There's a strong investigative tone throughout much of the book. Characters are trying to understand the scope of what's happening. What exactly has been discovered? What does it mean for humanity? And perhaps most importantly, what happens if the wrong people gain control of it? The narrative follows multiple perspectives, which helps the reader see how different parts of society respond to these emerging developments. Scientists see possibility. Governments see potential threats. And individuals caught in the middle are forced to decide where they stand. One of the most interesting aspects of the first book is how grounded it feels. Even though the concepts are big and sometimes even cosmic in scale, the reactions of the characters feel very human. Confusion, fear, curiosity, and occasionally ambition. The tone of Axiom feels very much like the opening season of a high-concept anime or superhero series. The groundwork is being laid, mysteries are forming, and you can sense that the world is moving towards something much bigger. If Axiom is about discovery, Maxim is about escalation. By the time we reach the second book, the world can no longer pretend that these developments are theoretical. Events from the first book have proven that the forces being explored are very real. And once that reality sets in, the tone of the story shifts dramatically. This is where we start to see power structures reacting. Governments begin asking difficult questions. Organizations begin forming strategies. And characters who were once observers suddenly find themselves participants in something much larger. The pacing of Maxim feels noticeably faster than the first book. Conflicts intensify, alliances begin to form, and sometimes fracture, and the stakes grow more personal for many of the characters. What I appreciated about this middle installment is that it doesn't rely purely on action to raise tension. Instead, much of the drama comes from competing philosophies. Different characters believe they understand what should be done with these new discoveries, but those beliefs don't always align. Some believe the power should be controlled. Others believe it should be shared. And some think it should be sealed away entirely. The clash of ideology creates the central tension of the book, and it pushes the narrative toward the final stage of the trilogy. By the time we reach Dictum, the trilogy has fully expanded its scope. The questions raised in the first book, the conflicts that intensified in the second, now reach their final stage. Without giving anything away, this final installment focuses heavily on accountability. The characters must confront the consequences of choices made earlier in the story, and the world itself is forced to grapple with the reality that some discoveries can never be undone. The tone of this final book feels both larger and more reflective. There are moments of intensity and confrontation, but there are also moments where the story pauses to consider what all of this means for humanity going forward. In many ways, Dictum feels like the final arc of an anime series. Everything that has been building across the trilogy converges here. Characters are pushed to their limits, ideologies clash, and the story ultimately asks a powerful question. What kind of future should humanity choose when it suddenly has access to unimaginable power? One of the strengths of the trilogy is its cast of characters. Rather than focusing on a single traditional hero, the story presents a network of individuals who each represent different responses to the same crisis. Some characters approach the situation scientifically. They're fascinated by the possibilities. Others see danger first, then worry about how quickly power can be misused. And then there are characters who find themselves caught in between. Individuals who may have personal connections to these discoveries, but who aren't sure what role they should play in shaping the future. What makes the characters interesting is that most of them operate in moral gray areas. Their motivations are understandable, even when their choices create conflict. And that complexity keeps the story engaging across all three books. The author's writing style plays a huge role in shaping the tone of this trilogy. The prose is clear and deliberate, which works well for a story built around complex ideas. Rather than overwhelming the reader with technical explanations, the narrative tends to introduce concepts gradually, allowing the tension to build as characters learn more about what they're dealing with. There's also a cinematic quality to the storytelling. Scenes often unfold visually, almost like sequences from a film or animated series. Moments of dialogue carry weight, and the pacing tends to shift naturally between quiet reflection and larger confrontations. Another interesting aspect of the writing style is how it balances speculative science with human emotion. Even when the story explores large-scale concepts about power, society, and discovery, the narrative always returns to the characters themselves, their fears, their hopes, their decisions. And that grounding helps the trilogy remain accessible even as the ideas grow more expansive. Overall, the Axiom Trilogy delivers a thoughtful blend of speculative science fiction, philosophical storytelling, and the escalating tension you might expect from an anime-inspired saga about power and responsibility. It's a story about discovery, about fear, and about the choices humanity faces when it suddenly realizes the future may be far more uncertain and far more powerful than anyone expected. If you enjoy science fiction that asks big questions while focusing on human stories, this trilogy is definitely worth exploring. And if you've read this series yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.